the first thing that I'm very happy about is that this book is very optimistic, peak human. Everyone can watch it here. And we live in a world that has pessimistic tendencies. And especially on social media and the news, there seems to be too much negativity and too little stress on positivity. So it's good to have some optimistic books once in a while. And I wanted to ask you, to start by asking you a personal question. So, what made you want to be an intellectual and an author?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it depends on how deep you go. It could be just the love of books and of literature and of history and wanting to live in that world. But obviously, you need some kind of message as well. I guess that's one reason why I always wanted to write, do research, learn more, and talk about what I've learned in various ways. And I think that's partly because I learned something important when I was young, and that was that my worldview was all wrong. And my worldview back then, which was very pessimistic, quite anti-capitalist, very much opposed to the modern world generally, and then realizing how much my life, the fact that I managed to grow up in a country free from poverty, hunger, and despair, was very much thanks to the Industrial Revolution, thanks to trade, to business, to technology. And well, if I could be wrong about that, lots of others could be wrong about that as well. And I wanted to tell that story. So in some way, that's one of my motivations.
When you were more pessimistic, did you feel a sentiment of complete hopelessness of the modern world? I think you mentioned the modern world when you described your previous situation. Would you say that before you thought that everything was doomed to an inevitable decline? And if so, how did this change?
Yes, no, I think that's a good description of where I was. I thought that the modern world was sort of ugly, hopeless, unjust in various ways, and then you start to think that if you don't fit in, and I mean, when you're young, you rarely think you fit in anywhere, right? But you assume that there must have been some past when we lived more in harmony with one another and with nature, and only going back there would make sense. What helped me to get out of that perspective was studying history and realizing that there were no good old days back then. Life was nasty, brutish, and short. And my ancestors in northern Sweden, they usually starved when the weather was bad. So understanding that they didn't live ecologically, they died ecologically at a very young age, that got me away from that mentality.
I suspect that empirical data was paramount in your changing of perspective, because a lot of the time people think very metaphysically, and they tend to subscribe to some views of history according to which, like some understandings of Plato, history is just a rapid decline and nothing can halt it, basically. And essentially reading history but also focusing on empirical data helps. And I think that you have been doing this throughout your work, because especially, for instance, when you're talking about capitalism, you are mentioning data against to lots of leftists and lots of people who are too much prone towards statism.
Yes, that's right. And, I don't think that every person who is opposed to uh, free markets and to open liberal democracies are driven by data to end up there. It might be that they have completely different values and attitudes to what's good in life. But I think I have a very hard time convincing them. But there are lots of people who reject uh, free market capitalism because they think that it's bad, that the outcomes are bad, that it hurts the poor, that it hurts the middle classes. And then they're just wrong on a factual basis. And I think it is easier to come up with an empirical case that might actually convince them.
Yes. Okay, so I agree with this, and I have met people of the sort. Right. So I wanted to ask you about your northern Sweden and Scandinavia, because I constantly see people, especially from the social democrat left, who present Scandinavia as a sort of social democrat paradise. And I hear also people from who are not leftists who say the exact opposite. Now, where would you fall there, and what do you think about this idea that Scandinavia has been a social democrat paradise?
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and what I'm trying to tell people about my own country is that Sweden has been socialist, and it has been a great, thriving, rich society, but never simultaneously, never at the same time. So, I mean, the background when we really grew much faster than the rest of the world and created one of the richest civilizations that has ever existed. That was a 100-year period from roughly 1870 to 1970. And that was when Sweden had a very limited government, a very open economy, very free market oriented. As late as the 1960s, we had lower taxes than other European countries, lower taxes than the United States. And that made us incredibly rich. But then, for a brief moment in time, then Swedish politicians thought, we have all this wealth. Why not spend it? Why not redistribute it and increase public consumption? And they doubled the size of government. They regulated most things in Sweden. And that's when we got a 25-year period of quite socialist policies in Sweden. But that was not our golden age. That was more like our Atlas Shrugged era, when the great innovators, the businesses like IKEA, they left Sweden for other places because they couldn't do business back there. Since then, it ended in a terrible financial crisis in the early 1990s. Since then, Sweden has reformed again and liberalized its economy. So once again, I would say that it's more free market than most European countries, and it's also outperforming most of them again. So, but this time around, it's a little bit more mixed than it was before. But it's quite easy to see that when we had the most big governments, we did the biggest mistakes.
Okay, so in a textbook fashion, lots of statists come in the 70s, they get the credit, and they try to create a propaganda whose narrative says that they get the credit for the wealth that the free market produced, or the freer market produced, and they completely destroyed everything afterwards. Or, okay, that was a bit hyperbolic, but essentially that was it.
Yeah, and I mean, if you have already created a thriving society, a very wealthy country with big businesses ranking in the export revenue, it's easy to make mistakes for a while without everything falling apart. But we were quickly losing economic growth compared to others. We didn't create a single net job in the private sector for more than 30 years. We didn't create the new employment opportunities or businesses or technologies. So it was a slow but steady decline during those years. However, compared to other countries, it might have seemed that, yeah, we were still one of the richest countries in the world. Only relatively we were losing out. But it's like that old joke: how do you end up with a small fortune? Well, you start with a large fortune, and then you waste some of it.
If you enjoyed this piece of premium content from the Lotus Eaters, head to our website where you can find more.